Buying a house or flat in anyone's life is a stressful time, but what can complicate things further and add further unnecessary stress is if certain questions haven't been asked and answered satisfactorily before you spend out for a surveyor or other professionals on a property you've made an offer on. So we're going to go through a list of things we think that you should know the answers to, ideally before even making an offer on the property, to save yourself from spending out unnecessarily, because depending on the answer you might decide that you're not going to go for that property. It avoids the situation, hopefully, where you've fallen in love with a property, put an offer on it, it's paid out for the survey, only to find out that had you have known, you could have saved yourself that money and looked somewhere else. So, item 1 on the list: extensions and loft conversions and alterations. What's important here is to establish that any alterations have the appropriate planning consent and building regulations approval, including paperwork, before you buy the property. This is important because if it's not in place, sometimes you can incur regularisation costs with local authority trying to retrospectively gain consent, which is not always actually possible, and it costs money and potentially could lead to reduced offers on future buyers in the future. There are also other considerations associated with this aspect, which are buildings insurance issues, because most policies have clauses that only insure compliant structures, and that means structures that have been signed off by a building control officer and have the appropriate paperwork for planning as well. So a very important thing to consider when buying a property. Item 2, allocated parking. If there's not a garage at the property or an obvious driveway to park your car, you need to find out whether there's allocated parking or not, and sometimes this can be a bone of contention in a neighbourhood, so it's very important, if it's important to you with your day-to-day operation of living at a property. So that's something you need to find out. Item 3, this is a follow-on really from the previous one: shared access. Has the property got its own access driveway, or is it a shared access driveway? And what formal arrangements are in place for that? This comes up occasionally as a bit of a bone of contention, where people don't do the homework before they buy, they move in, and then they find that the neighbour is less than cooperative in allowing them their right of way, particularly if there's no formalised paperwork. So this is very important to kind of get your head around before making an offer, ideally, on a property. Broadband access. This is a bit of a modern aspect, in the sense that broadband's increasingly more important these days, particularly for people working from home. So it's important that you establish that at least you're going to get a reasonable broadband connection with the house you're buying, particularly if you've got a home business which relies on the internet for successful operation. So something to consider there. What are the neighbours like? It never hurts to knock on the door and talk to the neighbours to get a gauge of how you feel they're possibly going to be when you're living at the property. And sometimes they'll disclose any bones of contention there might be, say to do with parking in certain places, noise and the like. So I think it's invaluable that people at least knock on the door and introduce themselves and have a little chat before they make an offer on a property, and it probably puts them on a better footing if it all is okay and they buy the property. I think people will respect that. Self-build properties. With self-build properties, it's important that you establish that a structural warranty that's CML accredited, that's the Council of Mortgage Lenders, is in place, or has been in place at least, and expired, which is better than it never being in place, before you buy the property, as otherwise some lenders won't even lend on the property. So this is important, and it's something that the vendor should have dealt with. It's not something the buyer should take a risk on. Brand new properties, building schemes. Building schemes are a set of restrictions that can operate on a locale of, say, an estate of brand new properties as an imposed condition to try to keep the properties looking uniform. And it can restrict sometimes what you can do with a property. So it's something to make sure, ideally prior to making your offer, whether or not there is a building scheme operating or not, and if so, what restrictions will that impose upon you as the owner, and will it prevent you from doing what you've got in mind for the property should you buy it. Type of construction of a property. This can be important if, say for example, the property is in an area of system built properties or early timber frame properties that aren't considered traditional build. Why is this important? It's important because sometimes building insurers won't lend on non-traditional construction properties, so it could potentially limit your audience when coming to resell the property. So something to find out ideally prior to making your offer. Is there mains, drainage and sewage at the property? This is an item that can catch people out if they're going for a viewing on a property and they might not go to look for whether there's a septic tank or a Clargester unit or anything like that. It may not be something they think to look for at a viewing, so they may be surprised to find out later on that there isn't actually mains drainage. There might be a Clargester unit or a septic tank which requires ongoing contracts with maintenance, emptying type contractors that they didn't bargain for. So it's something to ask ideally prior to making an offer. The other thing is that sometimes in the country there's not always mains gas laid on, and if you wanted that it can be quite expensive if it's in a very rural area. So again, another thing to check, or at least ask the question with the vendor through the agent ideally prior to making your offer, so you don't get an unwanted surprise later on. Retaining walls and who's responsible for them. This is a, so to speak, slightly off the wall topic maybe, but it's nevertheless an important thing to consider, particularly in areas like Benfleet or Leigh-on-Sea where there's a lot of gradients going on, and quite a lot of gardens have retaining walls that are actually performing a structural role in retaining higher level earth of the neighbouring property. So the point about these is that if you're responsible for them and they're in poor condition, they can be quite costly to repair effectively and may need structural engineers input as well because of the structural role they're performing. So it's very important, I think, if you see a retaining wall, which is where you've got higher level earth being held back by a wall and the subject property garden is lower, that you ask these questions prior to making your offer, because there could be a cost implication you didn't bargain for associated with that. A slightly more general item: how is the property positioned to suit your personal social needs and demographic, and can it be suitable for a growing family with links to schools, public transport, etc. These are all things that a little bit of homework before you even do the viewing can pay off to save you from going there, liking the property, putting an offer in and then getting drawn along into commissioning surveyors, etc., to carry out surveys, only to find that if you had have taken the time you might not have gone for that property and you could have saved yourself the expense. A final item worthy of note is a question to ask about whether or not the property has been underpinned in the past or not. There's different schools of thought on this. In theory, if a property's been fully underpinned, it should, in theory, never move again. However, future potential buyers sometimes have a view on underpinned properties and treat them with some scepticism. If a property's been partially underpinned, that's worse in most people's view than a fully underpinned property. But the judgment call is on you whether you either want to buy a property that's been at all underpinned because of the potential for different people's perceptions not making that property desirable to buy in the future. The important thing with underpinning is that it's been fully followed through by a structural engineer and signed off as adequate, gone through building control, and it's all been dealt with by a buildings insurer, and after the claim has been concluded, a statement has been issued from the insurer to say we are happy that the matter is concluded and settled. If you haven't got those things there, it makes for a lot more uncertainty. So you should be asking for those kind of things, and at least asking in the first instance whether the property is known to have been underpinned in the past, and then go from there. Okay, well, I hope this is seen as a positive video. I know I've mentioned a few negative things here, but it doesn't need to be a negative experience as long as you are equipped with the answers before you get too down the road of actually buying the property. And that way then you're not paying out for things that really, had you have known, you wouldn't have paid out for. So this is where I'm concluding this video. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope it's of some use to you and equips you better in your search for a property. Many thanks.